do that. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project. Today we'll be hearing from Susan Woods on transition, preparing individuals to navigate the post-secondary terrain. My name is Dalton Byers. I'm an educational outreach and research specialist um, at the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. Um, for reference, the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project, or ATTA, is here to present and develop resources to assist individuals with autism and professionals to support individuals with autism in their transition from secondary to post-secondary or employment. Um, the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, established in 1977, is here at Illinois State University and the College of Education, and we exist to provide learning opportunities and professional development on research-based practices and focus on recruitment, retention, completion, and transition for Illinois students. The Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project, you can get there via the autismcollegeandcareer.com or through the ICSPS website. You can find the ATTA website there as well. Thank you to Illinois State Board of Education for supporting this project. In a moment, I will initiate some polls to ask, where you're at and what kind of stakeholder you are, whether you're in secondary, you're yourself or a young adult or student, and post-secondary, a community member, a family member of someone with autism, or an employer. There's a good chance that you kind of intersect a lot of these. So I'm going to initiate that poll and 1 second. Okay, and I see that someone was asking about a recording. Yes, within the next like 2 business days, we'll try to get the recording, slides, and other things uploaded onto the ATTA website. And I believe there'll also be some communication out about that. So we'll keep you posted on that. Looks like our polls or results are coming in. Pretty good. Awesome. Okay, looks like here you go. Can people see Susan, can you see the results? Looks like we have a lot of people from Northern Illinois,
Yep.
Chicago, and then some of us from some further down. And we've got a lot of post-secondary and family members here today, and even an employer. So this seems very fitting for our topic today. Awesome. Okay. Well, it is my honor to welcome Susan Woods, our professional development consultant for today's topic, and I will monitor chat for questions and for technical support, but we will address questions at the end. Susan's email is here now, and you'll be able to see that again at the end of the presentation, just in case if anything is not addressed or you have other questions afterwards. So, Susan, I will let you. Um,
Thank you. I'm going to oh,
I'm going to
share my
stop sharing.
screen.
If I can stop sharing. There we go.
And hopefully that can be seen.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Perfect, perfect. Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm coming to you from Lake Sunapee, New Hampshire, believe it or not. And I was connected with these folks a couple of years ago, and Dalton reached out to me, and I'm happy to revisit this topic with a few additions. You've had my bio. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but I will just say a couple things, and that is I'm a retiree. I worked in higher education for 30 years. I worked at in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in their transition planning for Department of Developmental Services for 15 years. So you're getting a sense of how old I am. I did retire a number of years ago, but I launched a consulting professional development practice and also continued to teach as an adjunct faculty at several Boston area, Massachusetts community colleges. So that being said, this is an area of passion for me, and every opportunity I have to talk about it, I take. Um, Part of the reason I'm so passionate about it is that I still continue to see a lot of and hear about a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misinformation. So my motivation is to try to correct that and sort of give some context to that. Um, this is what we're going to cover. We're basically going to focus on transition from high school to college for individuals that have been receiving services. Most specifically, we're going to hone in a little bit on individuals that are identified as being on the autism spectrum, but a lot of this is very generalized information that is important. And we're also going to spend a little time, as Dalton requested, to explore some of the strategies and ways to help students develop employability skills and to identify strengths-based language to enable them to communicate their needs and skill levels. Again, I'm a teacher by training, so teachers are trained to talk about outcomes. So my hope is that at the end of our hour, you'll have an understanding of the laws. I'm not a lawyer. Some people love to dig into the legal briefs and cases, etc. I will have some links to lead you to that. But understand the laws and the difference between IDEA, which sort of was the development of the IEP system, and what happens in higher ed under the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehab Act. And then discuss reasonable accommodations. What happens? What does it look like? What to expect? How to get there? And then talk a little bit about some of the unique characteristics, both strengths and challenges, of some of our individuals on the spectrum. And then where do we bring this into helping educators and families assist students in acquiring the essential skills to be successful in this endeavor. So that's a bit about what we're going to do. So to jump off on, and again, some slides I'm going to whip through, and some slides I'm going to dig into, and be mindful of our time. But these are the laws. And essentially, those of you coming, attending from the K through 12 world, you know the laws, you know IDEA, you know what it requires, you know what a 504 plan looks like. The biggest takeaway from this is if an individual decides to enter higher education, whether that be a community college, whether that be Illinois State University, or whether that be Harvard, there are going to be certain rules and laws that are going to dictate what they are entitled to as an individual with a disability. And I'm using the term disability. A lot of K through 12 people say, oh my God, my students are not going to understand that word. And it's true. It's not a word that's part of their nomenclature. But we'll circle back to why that's an important word in terms of their rights and their responsibilities. So the ADA, which was reauthorized in 2008 under the first George Bush, there's a link there to what it does, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it does. And that's the first law that is used in higher education to govern what happens in terms of accommodations. The other law is both Section 504 and 508 of the Rehab Act. And this is where there's oftentimes a lot of confusion. I see this over and over again, where people may say, well, my son or daughter or my student is on a 504 plan, therefore that's just going to follow that individual into their college career. And the answer is no. That's not the case. It's the law is 504. The plan itself, and I'll repeat this a number of times, the IEP and or the 504 plan that was developed in high school is a high school document. It does not continue on once the individual leaves high school. So we'll dig a little bit more into that. But these are the two laws. And again, you're going to have access to these slides that they're also going to post on their site. So you can dig into this a little bit as well as where this comes from. But essentially, the eligibility is that an individual has a disability. So what are we referring to? Well, this is the definition. I'm not going to read it. It's pretty straightforward in what it is. Um, and it's a federal law. So one of the questions that sometimes comes up to me is, oh, gee, my son or daughter or my student is thinking of going to a university, going to Oxford. In England or a university in Italy. The Americans with Disabilities Act is that. It's the Americans with Disabilities Act. It does not carry forward to other countries. But this is basically the gist of what it is. It's a very, very broad statement. One of the things that happened when it was reauthorized is that it includes major life activities that included reading, concentrating, thinking, and communicating. Those were key changes. So in my time, again, I spent a good part of my career as an associate dean of student support services at a community college. And part of my responsibility was overseeing services for students with disabilities, which at this particular institution is about 10,000 student body, and it was community college. About 1,000 students identified as individuals that were requesting accommodations as a disabled student. These were the categories. Again, there's a lot of overlap. This is not discrete. This is not all inclusive, but this is what I saw. Needless to say, there were some upticks in some populations in my time there. I did this work for about 30 years. There was a significant increase in students on the autism spectrum, as well as a significant increase of students that I identified as having a psychiatric disability or a mental health disability. As we all know, most of us know, excuse me, there's a fair amount of overlap here. So it's not necessarily that a student has identifies just one thing. I'm just autistic, or I just have a learning disability, or I just have a nonverbal learning disability, or I just have ADHD. There's a lot of overlap, and it's incumbent on the institution's disability office to sort of parse this out and see what the most compelling challenge is and how that gets accommodated. But that's sort of a laundry list. Excuse me, coming over a cold. Legal obligations of the college. Again, one of the biggest takeaways from this is the college must provide access. So very different than the K through 12 world. The college cannot discriminate. The college has to provide equal access and has to provide whatever aids or services that provide that access. If the college does not do that, well, there's a number of things that can happen. Now, a little caveat, a little asterisk here. I reference the Office of Civil Rights. Without getting on my political soapbox, I'm just going to say my sense is that of late, they are quite a bit overwhelmed because their staffing has been cut significantly. But in a better time, if an individual found that they were not being accommodated, that the college or university was not honoring their statement of disability and their eligibility for accommodations, an individual can make many different steps. They might go to the dean. They might go to a hearing officer or a compliance officer. They might bring it all the way up to the president of the college. They may not be satisfied. And their next step would be filing a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. And there's a great link there that, again, given these times, may or may not be as active as we'd like. Very interesting case that I reference here, and this was way back in 1996. And this happens to be my alma mater, Boston University. There was a case brought by a student, Guckenberger, against Boston University, basically saying that she was not being accommodated for her disability. She identified it as somebody with a learning disability, and it went all the way up to the district court. And the essence, the outcome was they concluded that Boston University was not complying with the ADA and therefore was at fault. And they breached their contract by failing to honor and express representations for this individual to receive accommodations. So, in a nutshell, they lost in flames. And it became somewhat precedent setting for a lot of institutions um, to be able to turn to say, well, this was a valid request and the university didn't honor it, and they got in a lot of trouble. I used to say to the president of my institution, my job was to keep the institution out of court. And so that's just a point of reference. So this next slide is basically a side-by-side lineup. What happens in high school and what happens in college. And in high school, as you know, it's a right. I'm not going to read through all the things, but one of the biggest takeaways from this slide is the difference between IDEA and providing opportunities for success in the least restrictive environment, and the ADA and 504 and 508 of the Rehab Act, which is about access. And the way they get there is that there will not be, and you'll hear a little bit more about this in the next few slides, fundamental modifications of content, of requirements. Another big takeaway is that it is up to the student to disclose. And I'm going to talk about that in much greater detail. But that's a bit of a side by side, as well as the side by side of advocacy. In high school, students are supported by an IEP team. Those of you that are in K through 12, this is probably part of your job. And parents are very involved, and as they should be. This changes a lot in higher ed. An individual, even if they are under 18, is considered to be of adult status. So the individual has to advocate for themselves. Communication is with the individual. Faculty, for example, will very rarely versus never communicate with a parent. There may be an opportunity for a parent to be involved in a conversation, but the student is going to be at the center. And that's one of the biggest changes for a lot of families, for a lot of students, is how to prepare our students to be ready for that. And we're going to talk a bit about self-advocacy. And then there's logistical, and this is pretty much sort of a boilerplate for anybody. What to expect in high school versus college. I've put a couple kids through college. Many of you may have also, or may be in the midst of it. There's a lot of differences in terms of structure, in terms of the amount of time that an individual devotes to their work, the amount of work that's done outside the classroom, that's not done inside, and again, the difference in structure. This is just, a little bit of a key to follow. A little bit of a summary about high school versus college, special ed versus accommodations, school personnel versus a student. And again, you may know all this. One of the biggest takeaways here is the individual requesting accommodation has to provide proof, has to provide what we refer to as documentation. And we're going to talk about that next. But there's also some rights and responsibilities. And again, this is when we have to think about how do we prepare our students? How does the student recognize what's a priority in terms of their work? How do they get to class? Are they budgeting their money on their own? Are they taking medication on their own? If there's a lot of free time in the day, how do they deal with that? And also, how do they deal with distractions? Which is a pretty significant, especially if a student is living at a college with residential life. But now I'm going to dip into what happens. And you know what? I'm going to use Dalton as my student. Dalton, you okay with that? You're my student. You're coming to a college or university, and you want to say, and you've been accepted. Let's say you've been accepted at Illinois State, and you want to say, I am an individual that would like to let you know that I have a disability. And again, the term disability is being used. Some colleges and universities are getting away from that term. They find it's some stigma attached to it, needless to say. But ultimately, the office, the individuals, and they're usually within a student affairs structure that are responsible for this are looking at this with the eye to what the ADA says. So disability is a crucial statement or a crucial term that's being used. But you might find colleges and universities referring to themselves as accommodations office or access office. I personally, as an administrator, found that by putting disability in the term, it was easiest to find. If you're Googling around a college website and you're looking to find what are their rules, what's their process, that was the easiest way. But there's a lot of variation out there. But again, let's say Dalton is coming to the university and he wants to identify, and he's been accepted. So the first thing he's going to do is make a declaration or declare or state it. If you go around, and I have some examples of some websites at the end, and look at college websites, there's going to be a place where there's actually a form or a online form or a mail-in form where a student does that. And then with that, the student provides documentation. And this is where one of the misconceptions is so glaring that I see. Documentation is not the IEP. The IEP is a nice document. It's a nice reference point. It's not a source document. So what the college or university is looking for is the testing or evaluation or reports that got the student their IEP. Typically, though there's some variation here, because colleges can set up their own systems, typically this is assessments and evaluations and reports that are no more than 3 years old. So the takeaway there is, I say to sometimes families, the eighth grade documentation or the evaluation that was done, the neuropsych that was done when the son or daughter was 6, needs to be updated. Because what the college university is trying to glean from this documentation is where is the individual now and how does this affect the individual in their learning environment? Because from that, there's going to be an accommodation plan developed with the student. The student is very, very much a part of this process. It's very much an interactive process where the student is reporting. This is what happens. This is how my disability impacts me in a learning environment. It's a very, very key area to think about. So let's say that Dalton has done this. The disability office, whatever they call themselves, has reviewed the documentation. They've reached out to Dalton and they've said, let's set up a time to sit down and talk about what accommodations you're going to be eligible for at this institution. I'm not going to focus too much on these next two slides, but these are guidelines for documentation. And again, it's the student, it's observation, and it's from an external source, whether that's high school testing, a neuropsych evaluation, a psychiatrist report. It depends on what the student is identifying. But these are some guidelines for that. And again, it's pretty standard. One of the things I will say, excuse me, is that most college universities subscribe to some best practices. And there's some organizations out there. The one that I've been most frequently in touch with and following is called AHEAD, AHEAD. I think I have a reference to it at the end. And it stands for Association of Higher Ed and Disability. And they sponsor a lot of information, conferences. They have a very robust website. But a lot of that they will do is they will set some of the best practices that a college university will use when they're developing their own policies. So that's where a lot of this originates. Um, and so this again, it's going to be educational, psychological, medical records, um, but it needs to be fairly current. And particularly if somebody is identifying as saying they have a psychiatric disability, the college or university might request even more current status because there's a lot of change that can occur in somebody's functioning and how the psychiatric disability impacts them. So, again, back to Dalton. Let's say Dalton has submitted all that. He's submitted the documentation. He's communicated what happens when he's in a testing situation or in a note-taking situation or how his disability impacts him. And so out of that is going to become an accommodation plan. It's Dalton's plan. Dalton's my student. Dalton does with it what he chooses. What I mean by that is that it will be up to Dalton to share that with his faculty. And that's the only way the faculty will know that Dalton is somebody who's eligible for accommodations. They probably are not going to know, or they shouldn't know, why. It's not their right. It's none of their business. What they will know is that Dalton has been screened, his documentation has been reviewed, he's been deemed eligible, and here are the accommodations that he is entitled to. And those are going to be things like extended time for tests and exams, because he may have a slow processing speed. Anxiety may play into that. He may also be entitled to a distraction-reduced area for testing. He may also be entitled to a note taker or preferential seating. And then he may also be able to access some assistive technologies and equipment. Some schools, and Dalton and I were talking about this before, um, also provide support. And at the end of this, I have a wonderful resource to share, which is a colleague of mine who has a listing on his website. It's Dr. Eric Enlick, top college consultants of schools, universities across the country that have specific support programs for individuals on the autism spectrum. Some schools, the school that I worked at was a state operated school, and we had a lot of support that we basically delivered through grants. Dalton and I were talking about TRIO, which was a federal program that I oversaw. Sadly, I think it's gone now. But it was a lot of wraparound supports for eligible students for first generation, low income, and students with disabilities. Some colleges and universities offer this support. Oftentimes, if it's not grant funded, it's fee driven. What I mean by that is there may be an extra charge, an upcharge for some of this more specialized support, wraparound support. But it could be tutoring strategies, it could be study skills. These are not required under the law. So that's an important takeaway. These are really great support services, but the ADA and 504 of the Rehab Act does not require them. So if you find a school that has them, it's always good to check it out and see if that's going to be the right fit. So this is where the rubber meets the road. What is not an accommodation? And this is where there may be some variations and some things that an individual may have to really practice and get to know. If they're getting these type of accommodations in high school, they may not get them in college. The first and foremost is changes or modifications to course content. Okay. I had a student years ago that was a very, very bright young man who wanted to be an engineer, but he really struggled in math. He was asking for a waiver of the math requirement. Well, that's not going to happen. There's not going to be modifications to essential elements of a major. There's not necessarily going to be adjustment of academic expectations. There's a lot of conversation out there right now about attendance requirements. I know in high school under some 504 plans, attendance may have been a something that was flexible. That's likely not going to happen in a college or university environment. However, there may be exceptions. A hospitalization, um, very, very individualized circumstances may occur, which may need to be brokered. One of the things I would always say to students is this is why you want to be working closely with the disability office because they're going to be your mediator. They're going to be the go-between between yourself and the faculty because the faculty's syllabus is basically going to say attendance is taken, and if you miss more than 4 classes, your grade drops by a letter grade. That is up to the faculty. Um, the syllabus, as you may or may not recall, is the contract. That's where the faculty really has an opportunity to say to their student body, these are the rules of the road for my course. So there's probably not going to be deadline adjustments. Sometimes students request that. The hard part of that as a request for an accommodation is that ultimately the student is going to need to complete the work within a standard, probably 15-week semester. If they're asking for extensions on due dates, they're sometimes going to paint themselves into a corner because they still have to get the work done. So sometimes extenuating circumstances are something that happen. And I would oftentimes work with families and students if there was a hospitalization or a episode that meant that they couldn't attend class or couldn't complete the work. Perhaps an incomplete made more sense. But these are things that need to be brokered on a case-by-case basis. There's necessarily not going to be course or assignment waivers. Now, that being said, go back to that Guckenberg case, Guckenberger at BU. When she made her request, I believe she was requesting a waiver of a foreign language requirement, which was required under her major. In some cases, depending on the disability, something like a foreign language could be waived, or there could be another course substituted, especially for a student that has language processing delays. So that's something, again, that would need to be brokered. And the last area, and this is a tricky wicket, and I'll say that I could do a whole workshop just on code of conduct, is adjustment of behavioral expectations. And there's a great resource there that you can dip into about this. But the bottom line is college universities have a code of conduct. Now, would have students that were in the throes of a schizophrenic episode, or, they were symptomatic, or something was interfering with their ability to follow the code of conduct. Again, this is where that brokering is especially important to be known to the disability office, so there may be some opportunities for some flexibility. But that being said, the code of conduct is the code of conduct. So, summary page. What accommodations don't do. They don't lower academic standards. They don't substantially change essential elements of the program. They don't necessarily consume extra time. If a student needs extra tutoring, they need to get access tutoring. The faculty is probably not going to provide that. So again, access is key when we're thinking about this. So now, rubber meets the road. Let me just back up for a second. The one thing I will say that sometimes happen, and when I have students that, and actually I taught a class that I required the students, a psychology class, to do a public speak. And students with a pretty compelling anxiety disorder, sometimes are folks on the spectrum, sometimes with a psychiatric disability, were paralyzed by the notion of doing a public speak. I had some creative ways of accommodating students. One student did a podcast. They basically did a recording of themselves or a video. So there can be some creative ways of, if it's really something where the student is not able to meet that requirement in the fashion in which it's designed, but there could be a way to to do a workaround. One of the key elements here and the key takeaway is communication. The student needs to be comfortable, and we're going to talk about how to get there with communicating what they need. If an accommodation is not working for them, they need to go to the disability office or whatever, the access office, and say, this is not working. If a faculty refuses, that's not the student's battle to wage. It's definitely going to be a battle, and it's going to be waged by the institution because the faculty, and I have a great short story. I had a faculty member who had in his syllabus absolutely positively no recording of my lectures. When I went to Professor Jones and I said, well, Professor, we have a student that has an accommodation of recording your lectures. So we can't have that. He protested, went all the way up to the state union with it. He lost because it was a reasonable accommodation and we wanted to make sure that there was protections. He wanted his intellectual property protected, which he has a right, but we also wanted to protect the student's right to record the lecture. So again, this is where the communication is key. There's going to be clinical requirements, there's going to be internships, there's going to be a lot of program requirements that the student has to meet, and sort of working with their disability office to make sure they can do that is important. So, where do we do now? What can we do to prepare our students? Well, and other people do these same talks, and we all are in agreement about what students should be able to do if they're pursuing higher education. They should know why were they on an IEP? What did it do for them? Why are they requesting accommodations? What are their strengths? What are some of their learning styles? What are some effective learning strategies? And can they speak up for themselves? Can they say, hey, my needs are not being met. Let's talk about how to get there. One of the terms I use is metacognition. Metacognition is a nice fancy word of saying knowing what you know, learning how you learn. The more an individual can understand what their needs are, why is it if Dalton's my student and he's taking a test and the student gets up and throws something in the trash, everything leaves his head. Why is it that he's entitled to a distraction-reduced environment? Because of the way he processes information. So self-awareness. Whenever possible, again, I was from a community college background where it was open admission. But if a student is looking for a selective university or college, they need to be able to be prepared with the level of classes they're taking, have developed some of the time management, test taking, note taking strategies that made them successful, and really, really have a hard conversation about readiness. And this, I think there's a couple parents in the room or the school personnel that are working with families, sort of having that conversation about college capable. Yeah, I've got good grades. I'm academically capable of college. College ready. Can I handle the independence? And if I can't, how do we get there? And those can be tough conversations. So the first part of that is becoming self-aware. Again, like I said, articulating your strengths, practicing. A lot of our students on the autism spectrum do very well with some scripting, some practicing. How do I communicate this? Having an understanding of their optimal study conditions, how to deal with conflict, and developing healthy relationships, and knowing when to say, I'm having trouble. I need some help. That's one of the biggest hurdles, quite frankly. I can't tell you how many students I met over the years that would come to my office. Usually mom would be bringing them, and I'd say, why are you here? And they really didn't know. And really were reluctant. They said, I'm done with the IEP. I want a new identity. I don't want the special ed stigma. And that's completely understandable. In a college university environment, that pretty much goes away. There is no identifiers, unless the individual chooses to identify themselves. Again, basic things. Why am I going to college? What do I want? How is my stamina? How do I select classes? What accommodations do I need? And also, what environment do I work best in? And these are all questions that, quite frankly, every student should be asking before they're requesting their parents invest in higher education. And one of the things I found is that one connection in a student's life at a college campus can make a difference. That could be an advisor, it could be a disability services, it could be the lady in the cafeteria. One good connection of somebody that can be their go-to can make all the difference in the world. The self-management, again, this is sort of obvious. Waking up, getting to class, managing free times, healthy lifestyle. And again, this is not particular to necessarily to students on the autism spectrum or students that have had IEPs. This is pretty much to all college students. Um, how to stay on track, how to avoid some of the addictive temptations. I've had some sad stories of very, very, very academically capable and happened to be young men who went off to college and never left their dorm room because they were playing Halo or whatever video game was du jour. How to manage that. So self-management. And again, this may be something to work on, may require some direct conversations. The self-advocacy piece is a real important piece. And again, the more that this could be practiced in the K through 12 environment, one of the key ways I've always said to a student when they come to me is, do you go to your IEP? Well, no. Why would I do that? Well, it's a good idea because you have an idea. All these people, yes, it's a little intimidating, people talking about you around a conference table, but to have a good understanding of what the IEP did for you and what you can bring to the college environment when you're requesting accommodations is very valuable. And then also having a support network, a go-to, whether that be a therapist, a pragmatics coach, a counselor, or a trusted friend. And this is just a quick graphic about self-advocacy that might be useful for some of the teachers in the room. If you're, something to just grab. I didn't create it. But this is sort of, a tips, what does self-advocacy mean with some good icons. So I'm going to quickly run through these things. These are questions. Again, I'm mindful of my time. I've got about 15 more slides. Questions that I've been asked over the years. I've delivered this type of workshop with a lot of variations at high schools, at CPACs, parent advisory councils, at private schools, at public schools. What are some of the big differences that somebody should know? Well, one is that there is not necessarily a special ed liaison. Yes, there is somebody in the disability office, but they will only come to you if you come to them. So they're not going to seek you out. I used to say to students, if they met me on campus, I am not going to say hi to them until they say hi to me. I'm not going to out them in the cafeteria. Why are you talking to that lady who runs disability services? So really, the student is at the center. The student is driving the bus. The faculty will not know about the student's disability unless the student chooses to tell them. There is not necessarily any special financial assistance based on disability. There are a few scholarships out there. I have a link in the resource page at the end. Some state voc rehab will support students in public colleges and universities based on need. So that's the answer to that. Huge question is, I'm asked in many different ways, and it's, points here is, do I disclose? Is there an advantage to disclosing on an application? And the answer to that is it depends and sometimes it varies. I've said to students that were applying in Massachusetts, it was the University of Massachusetts, which is a huge, land grant university. Most likely that essay's not really being read very closely, and there's no clear advantage. On the other hand, if you're applying to a small school that interviews and the essay is a critical piece, and if your identity and who you are and what you've done is part of that is the fact that you are on the autism spectrum or the fact that you have a psychiatric disability, if that's worth telling the story about you, Well, absolutely. But it doesn't necessarily bring anything to the conversation unless it's very personal and talks about what you've achieved as a result. So that's a sort of around the bush answer to that. Typically, there are not in classroom assistance or coaching provided. There are some special programs across the country that may have some of those models, but for the most part, I would say you would not get that. This is some questions that I suggest they ask. If you're going looking at colleges, if you're interviewing people, there's a bunch of questions there. How does it work? Who's staffed? What are the ratios? What's their training? I used to do in-service trainings for faculty on universal design. I'm going to touch on that in a minute. Teaching strategies to make sure you're reaching all students. And universal design for instruction was sort of the methodology or the approach. I also did workshops for college faculty on understanding the autism spectrum. So it depends what the college university is doing. A lot of college universities highlighted their diversity initiatives, but sometimes they left off this piece from their diversity actions. Some colleges and universities are making a point of making sure that they are looking at their environments. Are they creating some environments that have sensory sensitivity? So that should be a question that you could ask. More questions to ask. I'm not going to one of the things that sometimes comes up is reduced course load, and that varies. That could be an accommodation, is not taking a full course load, and that's something to discuss. So, a little bit about our students on the spectrum, as it's getting to be 4:47. We know this, or you probably know this, what it might look like in the classroom. What are some of the challenges? Possibly. There may be some difficulty with change. There may be some anxiety, being overwhelmed. I had one young man, brilliant, very capable young man, who had a self-stim thing of rocking, and it was very distracting to other students. We did a three-way workaround with the college faculty, with the student. His mother joined in the conversation, and we seated Jeffrey in an area where his rocking would not necessarily be so noticeable to all his classmates. There may be a situation where a student has a hard time not sort of expressing themselves and may be interpreted as monopolizing a conversation. Again, there can be workarounds. One of the things I would tell faculty is to be very, very sensitive to the sensory cues or sensory issues, lights, sounds, textures, abstract language, just an awareness. So there's a wonderful book that I reference at the end. It's written by several people, one of which is Jane Theophil Brown from University of Connecticut and Lori, I can't remember her last name, from Boston University. But these were some highlights from their book, and I referenced the book at the end. Be realistic. Look at the current accommodations. If things can be pared down before a student, if they don't really need all the support that they're getting, junior, senior year might be a good time to start doing that. Familiarize yourself with the code of conduct. Increased level of responsibility. Things like making their own doctor's appointments, managing their medication, access to stress management support, and evaluate the college choices based on academics and environment and goals. I'm not going to focus on this because of time, but this is a whole couple full slide on community college. Again, for some students, this may be the entryway. This may be a way to have a smoother transition. Is starting at a community college. I'm sure Illinois has the same sort of structure that Massachusetts did and New Hampshire does, where a student can earn credits at a community college and transfer to a state university or college. And it's a seamless transfer. So for some students, living at home and getting a more sort of supportive environment may be a good way to sort of scaffold that experience. And then full disclosure, I did not work at a school with res life, with dorms. But I've polled a lot of my colleagues. I pay attention to a lot of the posts on some online groups I'm involved with. And I guess the bottom line is the student ready to live away? And one of the biggest question is, can a student request a single as an accommodation? And the answer is about as clear as mud on that one. It depends. Simply by saying the student would do better without a roommate, it would not necessarily meet the standards of an accommodation at a college level. Sensory issues, anxiety, stress, all the above. So it's debated, and it varies a lot from school to school. It's a good question to ask. So, a few other questions I get asked. I mentioned reduced course load. I taught online, I taught face to face, I taught during COVID. Um, One thing takeaway is not every student is going to do well in the online class. It's maybe a faster pace. They have to pay a very close attention. It depends on the student. So that's just that takeaway. Um, and the student loan process is really not different unless a student if they're an SSI recipient, there may be some eligibility again through their state voc rehab. Quick run through of myths. We know the answers to this. Students should be moved from an IEP to a 504 plan because 504 plans are valid in college. Yeah, that's a no. Hard no. Myth number two, they should be taken off the IEP or the 504 plan. No. Again, looking very closely at what that plan does and how it may be different in a college environment is very important. If a student receives accommodations in high school, the college or university must provide the same accommodations. Well, we know that's a hard no. It's based on the documentation and it's based on higher ed standards. High schools should add lots of accommodations to the school's high school plan so they can receive these in college. Again, another myth. That's not going to help. And lastly, students will receive more or better accommodations if they attend private college. So I forgot to say this at the beginning. Almost 98% of colleges and universities must comply with the ADA and 504. There's a couple of exceptions. There's a couple of religious schools in the United States that do not accept any financial aid. Therefore, they're not made to comply with federal law. There's like a couple of them. I think one of them is Bob Jones University. There really should be no difference. The thing to look for is, are there specialized support programs that might help a student? They may be fee-based, they may be grant funded. So, where do we go from here? And then I'm going to flip a little bit to some strategies. Again, this is just a redundancy of, understanding strengths, anticipating expectations, practice, practice, practice. Learn how to have the student learn how to write a good email to their professor. Learn the language of college. What's a syllabus? What's the registrar? And work on time management and have some backup systems. Again, college capable versus college ready. And it's not a race to finish. So, that being said, Dalton also asked me to try to incorporate some strategies into this talk. And quite frankly, I'm a big supporter of universal design. And I have a link at the end which tells you about universal design. A lot of these strategies really are universal design strategies. So if you think about universal design, it's an architectural term, access to the building, it's access to education. So some of these things like visual schedules, clear, concrete language, positive reinforcement, and structured teaching techniques. These are sort of no-brainers. That being said, some of the strategies to reinforce the academic and employability skills visual schedules, explicit instruction with cues, positive reinforcement, gradual transitions, preparing an individual, especially individual on the spectrum, for what happens next. Work-based learning, trying to integrate vocational skills into the curriculum. Social skills training, dissecting it. I used to teach students about social autopsies. What happens when their social interactions are really not acceptable? Peel the onion, take it apart, unpack it, and have the student be part of the strategy to figure out what comes next. Obviously, communication strategies and self-advocacy. Again, this is sort of redundant, but these are some other ways of approaching this that, again, real world connections, meaningful engagement. These are basically good teaching techniques. I know I'm running out of time. So being mindful of that, you can read this on your own, but these are some strategies to support some of the learners on the autism spectrum. We know these. Explain what's going to happen, prepare people, give enough time. Sometimes the communication is going to be, there's going to be a time delay. Be very clear and direct language. Maintain a routine. Familiarity is always going to be important to an individual with autism. Be mindful of the environment, sound, light, smell, touch. Obviously, calmer environments can alleviate anxiety. And consider the individual's behavior in the context of where they may be facing some challenges. Okay. Strengths-based language. This could be debated ad nauseum about whether individuals want to be addressed as individuals with autism or an autistic person. The community is still debating that. But these are some of the suggestions that I came up with, and that to focus on abilities, prefers concrete examples, listens carefully, thrives with clear expectations. And again, to approach it rather than a deficit focused with terms like symptoms or difficulties, to try to approach acceptance. I am running out of time. So these are some more. Hopefully, you can take a look at these when you have access to this online. I just want to point to a few of the resources that I mentioned, and then we have to have time for questions. A couple things I want to point to. One is that Washington EDU. This has some really, really good assistive technology resources. The other one I pointed to is Top College Consultants. Right down here. And I mentioned Dr. Eric Enlick. He has a listing of nationwide college models that provide support for individuals on the autism spectrum. The next slide, I mentioned AHEAD. This sort of sets the standards. College Autism Spectrum, more resources, College Spies. And, all of these you can hopefully click around in your free time. There's two wonderful Facebook groups, especially for any parents in the group, but anybody can, sort of jump in on these. One is run by Elizabeth Hamlet, and it's college transition and accommodations information. And the other is parents of college-bound students with learning disabilities, ADHD and ASD. And this is run by Eric Enlick's group and the College Spy. And podcasts, I've done a couple. You can click on these that are just great information. And more reading. I mentioned the book by Jane Thiefel Brown and Lorraine Wolfe. It was up there, this one. And there's a bunch of more things. So there's a lot of homework here, obviously, if you're primed for doing research. And I'm going to stop talking. Whoops. More, these are examples of college sites. The Oregon one is particularly good, and as well as some tools that you can take a look at. Again, I'm rushing now, sensory awareness, and I'm just going to end with this quote from a faculty about Sometimes adults and parents supporting students may think that their intelligence will carry them through college, but they have to look at their soft skills, how well they organize, plan, get work done in time. Schools, parents, and outside professionals should work together to make a plan to teach students these skills. So, that being said, and I'm sorry I'm running over, this is me. You can send me an email if we don't get to your question or if you don't like to ask questions in public. And I'm going to now stop sharing my screen and go to Dalton to see if there's any questions I can answer. And it's exactly 5 o'clock.
Perfect timing. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? I don't have any in the chat currently, either in chat or you can unmute.
Anything you were dying to learn that I didn't touch on, which may be a future webinar.
Mhm. Yeah, I'll
You'd love to hear
yeah,
more. Well,
Lotus. Yeah, it was very
so
well
I have a
done.
website and I also have, my email address is in there. Um, you know, I'm a retiree, so one thing I do have is time. I do a little of this consulting. I do a little bit of board work with some disability groups, but feel free to, send me an email saying I attended the webinar and I wanted to ask this question, but it didn't occur to me, and I'd be happy to exchange an email with you. So I thank
Excellent.
you.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, everyone. Yeah,
Next
maybe
time we
more
need
time
two
in the
hours. Yeah,
future,
thank you, Lori.
right? Very good. Just a heads up, November 20th will be our next ATTA webinar on developing vocational skills in school that lead to positive outcomes. So keep an eye out, and I'll be sending an email soon with a post-webinar survey and information about where you can access the recording and the PowerPoint, which will have all of those links for those resources, books, and so forth. So do check your inboxes for that or the ATTA website that we showed at the beginning. So thank you all
One
for
more
your
thing.
time.
I want
Go ahead.
one quick mention, Dalton, is that from that fellow top college consultants, there is a free webinar coming up that he's involved with called "What's Changing College Admissions for Students with Disabilities" on November 19th. If you go into Top College Consultants, the link there is to register and it's free. So I'm
Okay,
shilling for
excellent.
him.
All the plugs. So thank you all so much for your time
Thank
today,
you.
and I hope to see you again in November. Bye bye.
Bye bye.